My name is Marcia Webb. I am a professor at Seattle Pacific University. I recently wrote the book Toward a Theology of Psychological Disorder. It's important to discuss psychological disorder in the context of Christian faith because research tells us that psychological disorder is an increasing problem for society. In developed countries, psychological disorder accounts for more suffering and disability than any subset of medical conditions, including cardiovascular disease and cancer. So if it's happening in society, it's happening in the church, and people are sitting in pews in congregations and they're dealing with these issues. We know from the research as well that faith is a huge resource for coping for people and can help people with a myriad of life stressors, including psychological disorder. And church leaders and church members can be an enormous support, an enormous source of wisdom and encouragement. But sometimes the research also tells us that the church has been silent. So people in congregations may feel like there isn't support for their needs. Or sometimes in congregations, church members may make negative or stigmatizing comments. Maybe they're not aware that they're doing that, but that can happen, and people with disorders may feel silenced and marginalized. So there's an enormous need to talk about these issues and to have clarity about these issues today. Well, there are different types of negative or stigmatizing attitudes that are found specifically within religious communities. For example, we know that depression and anxiety are related, at least in part, to biological or genetic factors. But sometimes you'll hear Christians expressing the belief that people are 100% responsible for their happiness at all times, that we can have the joy of the Lord no matter what's going on in our experience. And if we don't, that somehow we're failing as Christians, that we lack faith. And that can be very discouraging for people who have these disorders and are struggling as much as they can. It's also possible in the church to hear negative or stigmatizing attitudes related to psychotic disorders. So people who have symptoms of hallucinations or delusions. There are some who believe that these symptoms are evidence of demonic influence. And I've actually known people who've gone to church and talked about these particular symptoms in a church community, and the community has responded by conducting an exorcism with these people. And in nearly every instance of which I'm aware, the person who had the disorder ended up leaving the church because they felt overwhelmed and ashamed and afraid and misunderstood. So that's just a tragedy. It's hard enough to deal with these kind of symptoms on their own, but to go to church and feel very misunderstood adds to the stress. I think that I have been thinking about faith and mental illness for almost as long as I've been a Christian. I became a Christian when I was 14 years old, and that just opened up a whole new world to me. I saw God and life and people in entirely new ways, in wonderful ways, in amazing ways, but I also saw pain that I hadn't seen before as well. That my faith opened up my eyes to some painful things that I hadn't recognized. I saw mental illness in my family, and I also recognized depression in myself, and I hadn't been aware of that prior to my conversion. And so almost from the beginning of becoming a Christian, I had questions about how God saw mental illness and what God thought about these things. And so I went to church and I read Christian books and I studied the scriptures, and I was still very confused. And I went to college and studied psychology, majored in psychology, and I only added to my questions. My confusion became more complex. And it wasn't really until I had studied theology and clinical psychology at the graduate level for several years before I started to have an initial sense of how I might integrate my understanding of what it is to be a Christian from a theological perspective, and what it is to have a psychological disorder, and how to integrate these two bodies of knowledge with a sense of intellectual and spiritual integrity. So then I started my career. I became a professor, and I started a practice. And I started to notice as well that there were students in my classes and also clients that I saw who had similar questions that I had, that had similar, who had similar confusion. And I started to wonder if maybe it wasn't just me that had these questions, but it was the church in general, that there was confusion around this. So I started to read the research about attitudes about mental illness in the church, and I started to do some research and do some writing. And eventually I wrote the book, Toward a Theology of Psychological Disorder. Well, a few years ago I was teaching a class called The Psychology of Religion, and we had come to a point in the class when we were talking about attitudes about mental illness in the church. We were reading some research, and we were all seated in a circle, and I was having each student comment on the research, give their impression, their opinion, that sort of thing. And we got to one student, and she paused and sighed heavily, and then she said that because of these negative attitudes in the church, she was no longer a Christian. She said she had been raised in a devout Christian family, and when she became an adolescent, she started to have some psychological problems, and her family did not understand. They thought that she was lacking in faith or rebelling, and apparently the situation just spiraled, and at this point during the class she said that she could no longer be a Christian because of these things. And I was just shocked and trying to think of how to respond to her in a comforting way when another student in the circle spoke up and said she had had a very similar experience. She was also raised in a Christian home. She also had some psychological problems, and her family was also critical of her. So she also did not call herself a Christian at that point. And it was just so heartbreaking to hear them. These two young women looked at each other across the circle, and there was just such pain in their expression. And I remember just sensing so much of their sense of alienation from their families and from the faith community and from God. It was just heartbreaking. So it was experiences like that as a professional that made me realize there really is a need in the church to talk about these issues, to bring reconciliation, the message of reconciliation to people who have these disorders, that they are welcomed by God. I am convinced that God loves people who have these disorders, and that it's not a disqualification to have a mental illness or to be broken. God loves people who are broken. That's the only kind of person there is in the world. We're not all broken from a mental disorder, but all people have flaws and pain and vulnerability, and those are the people that God welcomes. My hope is that the book will raise awareness about issues in the church related to mental illness, that it will make clear that some of the ways that Christians believe in today's society are not helpful, and they aren't necessarily biblical either. I challenge some of these beliefs in my book. And my hope is also that the book will help people who have these disorders to find ways to think about them that bring comfort and wisdom to them, and help them to know that God really loves them, that God is with them and supports them, and that there's hope, that there's a purpose for them, and they don't have to be ashamed, that God welcomes them and embraces them.